Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to Doc NYC Live. My name is Opal Hope Bennett, and I'm the Shorts Programmer and Director of Filmmaker Development at Doc NYC. Our festival ended earlier this month, but our year-round programming continues. We will soon be announcing the winter season of our Doc NYC Pro panels that will run from January to March. You can purchase a season pass or buy tickets to individual panels. Look to our website in the coming week for more information. Now, for today's panel, each year the Doc NYC Shorts lists pick 12 short docs and 15 features that we think are amongst the year's best. Today and tomorrow, we'll be talking to the directors from all 27 of those films, spread over 7 conversations. We've grouped these directors into loosely themed panels. And just earlier, our artistic director, Tom Powers, spoke with filmmakers the grouping of portrait stories. I will be speaking with the second panel, featuring work set in areas of past or present conflict. And then Tom will be back at 4 o'clock to conclude Shorts Day with the panel focused on the theme of personal histories. But for now, let's dive into this panel, and I will welcome my panelists to please turn on your cameras and come to the virtual stage. Hello, everyone. Good to see you. All right, so the guests in this panel are Gita, the director of Call Center Blues, a short uncovering the plight of U.S. deportees and their loved ones as they struggle to rebuild their lives in Tijuana, Mexico. Next is Anders Hammer, who directed Do Not Split, which brings viewers into the streets of Hong Kong amidst the 2019 protests and follows a season in demonstrations by local protesters. Then we have Skye Fitzgerald, director of Hunger Ward, which follows 2 female Yemeni healthcare workers fighting the spread of starvation among a war-ravaged community. And finally, we have Maya Novakovic, the director of Then Comes the Evening, a short depicting the bittersweet life of 2 grannies who live isolated on the hills of eastern Bosnia. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see all of you. You guys can all turn on your, unless you have noise in your background, I figure we could just kind of keep it open so we can have a conversation. And yeah, I'd love for each of you, I, of course, did a brief synopsis, but I'd love to have each of you, please first tell us where you're joining us from and share in your own words about your film. I'm gonna start with you, Maya.
Hello, everyone. I'm joining from Belgrade, Serbia, and my film depicts bittersweet everyday life. Yes, as you say, Opal, of 2 grannies living isolated on the hills of eastern Bosnia. Nature is the entity with which grannies speak, listen to, and respect. And I wanted to shooting the film about connection of spirit and nature in forgotten times.
Beautiful. Move on to Anders.
So I'm sitting in Oslo, Norway, but my movie is from Hong Kong. I went there last summer when the protests started. It started with a group of young people hitting the streets, protesting against the extradition bill, where people risk being sent to China, the mainland China. And then it's quite soon erupted into a big fight for basic democratic freedoms. So I ended up filming that for a very long period, and that was put together to the documentary called Do Not Split.
Excellent. Let's move on to Gita.
Sure. So I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and my film was shot in Tijuana, Mexico. And the film is about this unlikely community of deportees and who have settled in Tijuana, Mexico, and who work in call centers. Actually one of the 2, I should say, a couple in the film They were not themselves deported, but they are part of the ripple effect of deportations. And I think my interest in this film came from the fact that we hear about deportations and, you know, folks being arrested and sort of the rise in people being deported by ICE, but we don't often hear about what happens to them when they're on the other side of the border. And, you know, that the sort of the defining line of the border that separates us from them. And we often are on the phone with a lot of these folks from call centers around the world, but particularly in Tijuana, the sort of opportunistic capitalism has kind of reared its head in the shape of these call centers that are recruiting deportees who are English speaking. So for me, that was just a really interesting way, you know, way into this community and their stories.
Thank you. And then finally, Sky.
Yeah, I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon, and we shot our film in Yemen, in both the north and the south of the country, behind the front lines of the conflict there. And we basically embedded in two different TFCs, therapeutic feeding centers, where children are being treated to save them from starvation. And we worked with two women healthcare professionals, Dr. Aida Sadiq and Makia Maji, who are really just heroes in this work in pediatric malnutrition, but virtually unheard of as well. And when friends and colleagues connected me to these two amazing women, I started conversations with them, and they just turned out to be doing this incredibly difficult work in even more difficult circumstances. I wanted to showcase their work and their sort of abiding commitment to saving children from a human-caused famine. And so our intent really was to showcase them, but also to try to drill down on how the US and our tax dollars are also complicit in the conflict in subtle ways. So that was our intent with it.
And Sky, I'm going to stay with you for a bit. So beginning with 50 Feet from Syria in 2015, and then Lifeboat in 2018, which was, of course, received with great acclaim. This is your third film in the series focused in the Syrian Yemeni region. And you mentioned having friends who connected you with Dr. Ida and Nurse Mekia. This is no doubt due to all the time that you spent in this area. And I'm keen to learn more about, first of all, what sparked your interest, why this has been so important for you to spend such focused time there, and then what specifically made you want to tell this specific story in this region.
Yeah, there's so many answers to that question, Opal. You know, I think for me personally, I feel very privileged to have been born in the U.S. and I don't take that lightly. And at the same time, I grew up in a rather unusual way without running water or electricity in rural United States. And when I finally went to college, you know, I remember turning on the hot water for the first time and just being amazed that water would continue to flow from that faucet. And that moment has stayed with me for a long time. And I think it's deeply influenced how I see the world and how I appreciate the things that so many of us here in the US take for granted. And I think there's that sort of foundational piece of how I grew up that has sort of influenced the topics that I take on over the years. And when the Syrian conflict began, you know, I knew a Syrian American doctor here in Portland who wanted to volunteer as an orthopedic surgeon on Syrian refugees flowing across the border into Turkey. And we were friends. And he really wanted to find a way to get that story told, right? To somehow bring the story of what's happening in Syria to a broader audience. And so we collaborated, we partnered together. And each film in this trilogy has been a variation of that, right? One friendship leads to another friendship, and we find a way to try to get people's stories out in a way that they can collaborate with us and that they want them out. And that's how Hunger Ward came to be as well. It came through friendships and long abiding friendships where someone said, you really need to talk to Aida because she's doing this incredible work. She wants someone to spend some time with her and to find a way to get the story of her work out so that not only people could be more aware of it, but so that more resources could be marshaled to support her work, because the blockade, the air and sea blockade in Yemen is so extensive and so long-standing that doctors like Ada have a very difficult time getting supplies, getting medicine, right? And even getting a salary to support her work on a daily basis. And so we're deeply committed to her work and helping her support her clinic however we can.
And so how much time did you spend filming with Dr. Aida and Nurse Mekia?
I wish I could have spent many more months, but the strictures of working in Yemen are pretty profound. So we spent about 5 weeks in both the north and the south of the country, and that was limited by our visa because it took us 8 months to get the visa. You know, it's a conflict zone, and so they don't give visas to journalists or filmmakers, full stop, unless you find a workaround. And if you make it into the country illegally, they'll immediately deport you or put you in prison. So we had to get the proper paperwork, and we did, but it was only through 2 trips to the embassy in DC and pulling in a very high level person in the former Obama administration to meet with the ambassador before we could even get the visas. If you overstay your visa in Yemen, they will put you in prison or deport you immediately. So we're really limited by time, and we had to carefully shape the story we're telling with that knowledge, right? Knowing that we had this amount of time and we had to shape our story within that very carefully.
Got you. Okay. I'm gonna move on to Gita and Anders actually together, because you're each both dealing with fairly sprawling topics for which you decided to take a focused approach. You know, Gita, I feel like immigration is, you know, to your point, when you first introduced, a topic that everyone knows sort of everything about and not enough about. Like, it's spoken about in a very sort of broad manner, and folks are regarded or referenced in a group way. And your film takes a real focused approach on a specific problem that is right in front of us, but we're not familiar with. You know, I love your point about it being an interesting entry point, because I remember the first time I saw the film, I thought, oh my God, like, you know, all of us are interacting with the call centers on a regular basis, but, you know, who knew that this is the story behind it. And then, you know, Anders, similar thing. I can't tell you how many films I saw on the Hong Kong protests, yours, of course, being quite distinctive for bringing viewers right into the midst of it. And so I feel like in each case, you both had such, you know, broad topics that you could have really shared a lot with. Why was a short documentary the best way to tell these stories? And I'll start with you, Gita.
So I think for us, I was working in partnership with Topic, and at the time, you know, the story seemed to me that, you know, a short, again, as far as going there, and I was interested in kind of a portrait of the community and what that might look like. We weren't necessarily thinking to follow folks over the course of years, right? I was really interested in something that kind of could take you inside of their lives. What does it mean to, one, be displaced, and then two, to be living, you know, literally right across the border from what used to be your home. And often for a lot of the folks who are deported, they literally, this country, the US, is all they know. So it's not like they have a connection to, you know, where their family immigrated from necessarily. So so for me, it felt like a short could, you know, sometimes a short kind of cuts through a lot of the nonsense, like a lot of the excess that we as filmmakers, like, you know, we always think that longer might be, you know, again, somehow the storytelling is better, but sometimes I find a short is really succinct and to the point and leaves people wanting more. So that was appealing. And then, of course, once I got there, I will admit that I was like, this could be a series. This could be a feature. You know, when you
Yes.
get caught up in people's lives there, and you sort of start to see the potential. You know, obviously it can change, but I had already, you know, committed to a short, and so I think
Yes.
having
Okay.
people who held me accountable to that was helpful in keeping me on track, because I'm sure I could have strayed easily.
Yeah. So you saw the extra story that I saw too, because
Oh
I'm
yeah.
like, there's more story there.
I'm still working on that story. That's
Yes.
there's like a narrative film somewhere there, but yeah.
Yes. Precisely. Okay. Good. 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 And Anders.
So I went to Hong Kong on my own last summer, and basically first I was just curious. I really wanted to see it for myself, and I didn't know if I would work on it or not. I was just sure that if I were to film and make a documentary, I had to feel that I can contribute with something. So when I started, I had the idea of trying to get as close as possible and trying to capture the incredible intensity of the streets. So I just started filming, and after some weeks, I made a pilot and I sent it to Field of Vision, which is a film company in New York. And I worked on a number of short documentaries with them earlier. Made 3 short documentaries from Iraq and Syria in collaboration with Field of Vision. And I really knew that if it was possible to work with Field of Vision on this as well, that would work out. That would be perfect in the way that I sort of dived into the situation. They are very flexible and they are specializing in short documentaries, and I'm still in daily contact, and it's been for like 1.5 years now. So just very happy with the situation. It's something that didn't exist when I started making
Yes.
documentaries. So it has changed a lot. I've made quite a few investigative journalism programs, like 1-hour documentaries for a broadcasting company here in Norway. But working with Field of Vision on short documentaries really opens the way for me to experiment and try to push myself, and they push me as well. So no, I'm happy with the situation.
Oh,
But
they
I
are a
definitely will
brilliant team
continue.
over there.
Yeah, sorry for the delay. I will definitely continue working on the topic. So I want to continue working on the expansion of China and also the situation in Hong Kong. But this makes sense to publish now.
Yeah, no, what I was saying is they're a brilliant team over there. And, you know, if you're going to do a documentary short, you know, as you said, and you want to, you know, have that creative input, but also flexibility, they're really fantastic at Field of Vision. So yeah, so I'm glad to hear as well from you that you seek to mine this topic for more story. Are you also currently working on that project, or is there's just the interest there and you might do it later?
Pardon?
I'm sorry, are you also currently working on a longer, a deeper
No,
dive into?
we actually just extended the version. So the version you screened at your festival was the final version, and
The
that's
longer version,
almost, yeah. That's the long version, but it's still a short documentary.
right?
First, we made a 20-minute version that was screened at the Sundance Film Festival, and then since you both had a pandemic and then the national security law happening in Hong Kong this year, we really felt we
Right.
had to expand it. So it became a much longer project. And I think if people only saw a movie about the protest now, they would wonder about what happened to the situation this year, because it's really been a dramatic year, this as well in Hong Kong.
Right. And so you don't have plans to continue to see what's happening now in the wake of the Lost Passage?
Oh, I definitely will continue working on this when it becomes possible to travel a bit more normal again. It's not possible to enter Hong Kong for me at this moment.
So going back to the film, because we had made the point about how immersive the experiences of watching Do Not Split, and I know you have a background in photojournalism in sort of conflict areas. And so I imagine that was brought to bear in you being able to get embedded so intimately and so closely with the protesters. Can you speak about that experience of, you said you went on your own, how you were able to, in the midst of all that was going on, gain that sort of access that you did?
I in 2007 I moved to Afghanistan on my own. So, and then there was a big war and still ongoing in Afghanistan. But I ended up living there for 6 years, and that was also the place where I started working on documentaries. And then I had to develop ideas how to try to make stories that would actually engage people and make people care abroad, because it felt very dramatic in Afghanistan, but quite little came through in the news. So I started there trying to work closer on a conflict, and I also worked later in Iraq and Syria and Egypt. So I have some methods and some ideas that I arrived with in Hong Kong. And it's for me, this was really a physical project. I think not having never lived in Hong Kong before. So for me to contribute, I felt I could do it through movement, like trying to follow the protests closely, trying to film in a way that you sort of float around amongst the protesters. That was the idea. And it sort of worked out by just staying with them for a very long time. I got to know the people. Most of the people you see in the movie I met in the streets, and it sort of, you develop trust over the period, and then I was free to move among them. So it's quite a lot of running and quite a lot of failed recordings, and some successful, and some more successful that were not too messy, ended up in the movie. But for me, it was really like a physical thing, but it was so much energy, and it's so much young people, so much hope and desperation and despair and fear. So I felt I was just like filming on that energy, and my situation was easy compared to everyone else, like facing the police and risking severe sentences.
And so there wasn't sort of a challenge of getting them to trust you, to let you be. I mean,
that was definitely a challenge. But I'm quite used to working on that. Like in Afghanistan, I was constantly, when I was traveling in the countryside, I was constantly trying to convince people that I was not a spy, because I looked very foreign. And I also often ask a lot of questions about the security. And sometimes you also have people working on intelligence for military asking the same questions. So that's sort of a situation I'm used to. And it's quite, for very good reason, there's quite a lot of paranoia and fear in Hong Kong. Cameras everywhere, and they were definitely tracking protesters. And it became more and more intense during the period, like the conflict was escalating, which I think you could also see in the movie. But that was basically, getting access was the big challenge. But that is also like the challenge for everyone working on documentaries. But here was, yeah.
It's a little bit higher when you're dealing with the subjects in somewhat vulnerable postures, which, I'll come back to you, Gita, is also the case with deportees, right? Like, so when you have as a base level, as a filmmaker, when you're going to a documentary filmmaker, when you're going to film a subject, right, there's a hurdle of needing to trust build. Then you up the ante in a circumstance where, either the circumstances that they're presently in or that they've been through in the past might make that particularly challenging. So, Anders, you're dealing with that, of course, in Hong Kong. But Gita, same thing with deportees, I would imagine. Can you speak to that challenge?
Sure, absolutely. There was a lot of thought that went into that. And so the team I worked with here, there was Topic, and then, of course, and they were incredibly supportive, and
Brilliant.
wonderful to work with. But also we had Multitude Films, and Multitude Films, you know, a local production company here, and their sort of, I think their agenda, like mine, is to make sure that there is, you know, diversity, equity, and equality, and you know, that we're really ethically sort of conscious of what we are doing and think about the ways and the impact of the work we do. And there's really a kind of a do no harm policy in place. Like when you move in and out of these spaces, when you're dealing with vulnerable communities, you want to make sure that you know, you leave with them, you know, again, we don't want to put them in any danger. You want to make sure that you don't do anything that puts them at risk, you know, or again, causes harm. So we, in working with Multitude, we partnered with a producer in Tijuana, his name is Abraham Avila, and he was instrumental. He and his team were instrumental in helping us to find folks who are willing to talk to us. For a lot of deportees, I will say that the first thing that they normally do once they are dumped literally across the border with no money and nothing, you know, and nowhere to go, is they immediately try to cross. And so they try to go back, you know, because they've left behind children, families, you know, and they don't know where they are, right? Or they have nothing, nowhere to go. So to get folks to talk to us who might still be thinking of crossing, or might have, you know, again, a record in the US that they are trying to get cleared, you know, it's challenging. And interestingly, what we found, the most vulnerable are women who have been deported for all sorts of reasons, you know, for essentially, oftentimes they have children left behind. They are fighting a court case, or they're fighting, you know, again, to be able to have the right to cross. They're going to try to cross again. And then in Tijuana itself, they are extremely vulnerable because of poverty, obviously, their status as women, and, you know, a somewhat conservative patriarchal society. They are often preyed upon. So as you can tell from the film, we were not able to get a female deportee to talk to us. So we instead got these two young women whose one of whom had a mother who had been deported, and, you know, so she was part of the ripple effect. What happened to her was part of the ripple effect. But Abraham was really instrumental in helping us find all these folks and reassuring them that we were not doing, you know, some sort of, you know, extractive filmmaking, that we were going to, you know, the team wasn't going to fly in and fly out and then abandon them, that he was local, he was part of the community, you know, that we would remain in touch, you know, so that really helped. And I think that that's important, you know, again, for all of us, right, who work, I think Sky, you
in the
mentioned,
space,
you know, everyone has connections, right? And the idea that you are, you know, again, making the film with representation from the community that you are filming, right? Folks who can not only, you know, again, they assist you in maybe gaining trust, but they also hold you accountable. And it was really important to me that I be held accountable by Abraham, who would say to me, who watched the film and would say to me, you know, would point out things that he was like, oh no, that's a very American perspective. That is not the perspective of someone from here. That is not, you know, like, or this is how we think of it. And he said something to me once, because someone, I think, and it might have been me, but someone mentioned the term reverse migration. And he said, what are you talking about? There's no such thing as reverse migration. Migration is migration. He was like, that's a, you know, like a Western, you know, that's like a
concept.
You know, that's a Eurocentric American, you know, context. And I was like, okay, thank you. Because I think sometimes that term is bandied about, right? So it was great for us to have that. And I think it made the characters very comfortable, that there was, again, somebody local who really understood what the dangers that they were up against, you know, in putting themselves on camera. So
absolutely. Sky, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'd love to unpack some of that with everyone here, because I think what the question that posed to me, that I think a lot about, and I'm sure each of us here does, is, you know, how that responsibility takes different forms with different relationships in different places at different times on each project, right? Like, I'm sure, Gita, for you, as you said, you're in contact, right? And you're continuing those relationships. For us, we have this ongoing issue where one of our local producers, Adele Hassani, we purposefully had to keep him in the background because the danger was so great to him that if his name was front and center, either in the field or in the credits or in any way, he was in real danger. And in fact, you know, he was arrested 2 months ago while working with 2 other journalists, French journalists, and he's in prison being tortured right now, right? For simply doing his job. And so as a filmmaker, this is my friend, this is my collaborator, this is my field producer who I know is in prison, and I feel a deep abiding responsibility to help him, right? Because I know he was imprisoned falsely on false charges. And so I think it's, you know, these are complicated questions that we have to deal with. And I'd love to hear how each of you feels about that. For me, like, I'm working every day to try to get him out of prison right now, because he not only contributes so much to our project, but he became a friend during the course of the project, right? And I want those relationships to continue.
But
Can I
Scott,
ask?
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say
Sorry.
that you still tried to protect him. You know, you did what you, like, your tactics were to protect him in the field. So you did the right thing, you know. It's like
I want to ask you guys to put a pin in this, because this is, of course, germane to the larger discussion of, right, making films in conflict areas. And so this is a topic that is definitely on the list of questions. But I want to talk to Maya, who we haven't gotten to speak with as yet. Your film, of course, and I want to address this head on. You know, we put you in this grouping, given the historic context of Bosnia, and I want to come back to that question with respect to you know, the background that may or may not have informed this film, but at the forefront of this film, or of this presentation, is a beautiful naturalistic, in my opinion, just outstanding example of how stunningly gorgeous nonfiction can be. There's so many moments of exquisite composition in your framing, and I have to open with a question about your creative approach to this film, because it comes across as such a piece of art.
Thank you. I grew up in the village where those grannies live, and I used to look after sheep with them when I was little. So they are very close to me. I know they all my life, and also Nikica can help me. Yeah, sorry, my English is. I takođe, kada sam sa njima, na primjer, pošto sam dijete sa sela.
And since I'm the girl from the countryside, or child from the countryside,
kao i Skype, to me naučilo da vrednujem male stvari.
Just like for Sky, that taught me how to value these little things.
Koliko je rad tog običnog seljaka.
How much work of this common man of a villager is
veliki.
Is big.
Koliko ne zaslužuje.
How much he doesn't deserve.
Kako ne zaslužuje zapravo da ga primijetimo i da poštujemo njegov rad.
Sorry, how much he deserves to be noticed and his work to be respected.
I ono što je meni privuklo me da se bavim ovom temom jeste da sam ja to dijete koje je ustajalo od 5 ujutru do 7 uveče i bralo maline.
And what attracted me to this topic was that I was the child who got up at 5 a.m. and picked raspberries till 8 p.m.
I da sam tada, zato su tu prisutne ruke i noge, jer kad odim posle takvog dana na spavanje, to su kadrovi koje ja vidim pred očima.
And that's why, for instance, there is a lot of emphasis on feet and hands, because when you go to sleep after a work day in the field, that's what you see when you go to sleep, because you were looking at feet and hands for the whole day.
Isto tako završila sam istoriju umjetnosti i bilo mi je bitno, s obzirom da sam znala da sam dijete sa sela i da su moji roditelji poljoprivrednici, zahvalna sam im što su me dopustili da studiram nešto što volim.
Also, I finished history of art, and I'm very grateful to my parents who are farmers, so to say, that they enabled me to pursue this thing that I like, I love.
I bila sam spremna i dalje sam spremna da se vratim na selo i da to isto radim, ali bar da znam da sam svoje oko koliko toliko obrazovala.
And I'm always ready to go back to those fields, but I know that I have managed to train my eye.
I da sam jednostavno i da su mi te slike i da je slikarstvo dosta i poslužilo kao uzor.
So those paintings, and especially realism paintings that I met, so to say, on these studies of history of art, came about as inspiration and reminder about my childhood.
I to me postavilo kao što Gauguin ima sliku odakle dolazimo, ko smo i kuda idemo.
Just like Paul Gauguin has a painting, who we are, where do we come from, and where are we going?
To mi je možda i bilo glavno.
That was a main.
Da napravim ovaj film i da se vratim na sve prethodno što sam doživjela.
That was a main trigger to make this film and relive what I've already been doing.
A isto tako bavim se i filmom i teorijom filma, pa sam pokušala da to inkorporiram znanje koje sam naučila iz filma i gledajući film.
And also I learned a lot about the theory of film, and this was a chance for me to connect the theory and practice and apply it to my film.
So you were directly influenced by the composition, still life composition in painted art. Oh gosh, yeah, you can really feel that in a lot of these sequences. It's absolutely stunning. Yeah.
Na primjer, ili mravi koje su na nogama bakinim. Ne, izvinite. Just translate me.
Rekla ti je da se vidi da ti ne treba utjecalo slikarstvo i da to izuzetna stvar da se baš vidi taj slikarstvo.
Da, cijeli film sam zamislila kao jednu sliku.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I imagined actually the whole film is imagined as a painting, as a triptych.
Prva je zelena faza.
So there is first comes with the green paste
sa impresionističkim
with
bojama.
impressionistic colors.
Srednja je siva
then,
sa djenem vrijeme.
And then the middle phase with this gray and storm.
I na kraju imamo narančastu kao zasićenje boje i zrelosti.
And in the end we have this orange as a saturation of colors and maturity.
A to sve kao metaforu koja ukazuje na prolaznost i propadljivost materijalnog života.
And all of that is a metaphor just pointing out to perishable of material, perishability of material. Vanitas thematics.
That's brilliant.
Thank you.
Wow. I was not aware that so that's a formation. Well, it's used in film, of course, too. That's absolutely brilliant. I'm curious. You grew up with the grannies. I'm curious about their influence or anything that you took from them in terms of how you were crafting your depiction of them and of this life that they're living in this village.
Ono što su me one naučili jeste kako da prikažem priču bez riječi, samo njihovim djelima.
So what they taught me is how to portray this story without any dialogue, only using deeds as a carrier of action.
Zato što su one sve jedno drugo rekle kroz svoja djela.
Because they told each other everything already through to those deeds.
I da jednostavno i strpljenju i
and they taught me patience.
I nekoj mudrosti koja je iskrena, ali možda nam i ne ide u mudrost koju običan narod nosi sa sobom.
And some kind of wisdom that the common man carries with himself.
That's brilliant. So I'm gonna stay with you to pivot a bit with to speak about the history of conflict in Bosnia, and these grannies, of course, were living through that time. I'm curious. I mean, this is of course not something focused on in your film on the surface, but is there any aspect that you feel informs a greater context within which to view it? And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But you know, this is of course the history of this region.
Pa da, mislim, bake su tamo bile isto i ja sam svjedok svega toga što je bilo tamo i desilo se.
Yeah, grannies lived on that hill during the war, and also I lived in the nearby village during those wars of the 90s.
Ali u tom smislu nije bila tema filma, niti sam želela to da prikazujem.
But it doesn't have anything to do with the film, and I didn't really want to portray that.
Zato što smatram da sam ja tu živjela, proživjela i da mi je rata dosta za života.
Yeah, because I've been there, I lived through that, and I'm sick of war for my life.
You're here.
Da bi ne bi bilo dobro da nastavim tim da se bavim, ja bi se osjećala lošim, želim da se bavim nekim inspirativnim stvarima koje mogu lijepo da utiču na mene.
Yeah, and if I included that, I would feel bad about it because I would like to portray this beautiful version of us.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Okay. So I'll bring it back to where you were going, Sky and Gita, with respect to telling stories where there is either ongoing conflict, and Anders, please weigh in here as well, either ongoing conflict or the stories are covering a circumstance that has arisen as a result of conflict. And the particular challenges and responsibilities as we're going into Gita that implicates.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat just the last part? You dropped out a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Telling stories in settings that are either in ongoing conflict or the circumstances that you're covering were a direct result, have arisen as a direct result of conflict, and the challenges and responsibilities that those implicate.
Sure. So I think, I mean, I can speak from my experience also too, and just the experience of having worked with, I think folks who probably have more of a background like Anders, who are specifically, journalists who were trained to cover, conflict zones and what is happening there. And I think what Sky spoke to, the ethics of documentary filmmaking and sort of, I think the idea is to make something that is the least extractive and that also is not disempowering to the community in any way, that is not sort of this, is to not perpetrate kind of the colonial history of documentary. Particularly when you go into a conflict zone, you are dealing with communities that are already incredibly vulnerable, right? That are in desperate positions. And I think for us as filmmakers, particularly if we are outsiders going in, there is, it's sort of there's whole courses on this, right? So, but to try to summarize doesn't do it justice. But I think, to really think through, every step that you're going to take, everything that you're going to do, who you might endanger, how you might endanger them, how you can mitigate that, and the footprint that you leave behind, all of that is critical. And to try to set in place ways, and I think it sounds like, Sky, that's what you did, the ways that you can, if they are to, there are obviously people on the ground who also want this story told, right? Might want to participate, but it puts them at great risk. How do you protect them? How do you protect them is critical, and make sure, oftentimes it's about leaving their name out, making sure that they are never seen with you, again, using like encrypted phones and making sure your communication is encrypted, right? There's all these ways to do this. But so there's that side of it, but then there's also the side of making sure that they are as empowered as possible in the storytelling, that you are not, shooting from this kind of colonial lens or looking through, as again, sort of overlaying the lens of like the outsider, and that you are really just providing a platform for their voices because they're biased, right? They've existed forever. They know what folks on the ground, particularly in a conflict, know what is needed, and know, and know what they are trying to achieve. And so it's, again, you're just ideally you take the stance of being the platform and allowing them to lead in the storytelling. And I think willing to be and having folks on the ground, again, who might, if you can stay in communication with them, if it's safe to do so for them, who can constantly hold you accountable, who can, inform you, make sure that you are telling the story in a way that is consistent with their vision as well of what is needed for their community. I think those are sort of the, some of the key things, and not even all of them, because again, it would be like a 3-hour, like it would be like a weekly, I think. And then there's also, issues about risk. And I think, Anders, I remember you saying that you did, I think, a course, and again, risk, I believe it's called. That was, there's like literally classes that are put out there for journalists who are entering these zones that are about like everything from first aid to, some of these ethical questions. So I think those are things that we could all, maybe look into before we go into these zones, and make sure that we're, again, it's because it's a holistic picture, right? Like you're talking about an ecosystem that you're stepping into, with your perhaps bringing in, if it was an environmental thing, you might be bringing in disease and other things. And similarly, when we look at this, we have to make sure that we are taking the greatest care possible to do the least harm.
For sure. And so again, I'll pose the question to you, Anders and Sky, but focused, on these projects, like where these concerns arose, maybe specific to, do not split into Hunger Ward.
Yeah, I really agree with what Gita said. So there's so many dilemmas, and it's so easy to end up being exploitive in so many ways. But I won't repeat what she just said. But the situation in Hong Kong was quite unique, because it also became much worse during the period I worked there. But definitely it was the safety of the protesters, the very young people taking great risks. There's the risk, the direct threats in the streets, where they were shooting with tear gas and rubber bullets and different kinds of weapons, homemade weapons, and the police and the weapons the police armed with. Things, firebombs were flying around in the air, and sometimes people would catch fire. So that was one part of the threat. But then you also had the surveillance, which is a bigger threat, I think, for the longer run, where they are following the protesters. Sometimes the police or the intelligence are following them home, and a lot of people have been arrested. And it's still happening. Like just the last days, there's been a number of arrests in Hong Kong, which tracks back to specific days during the protests. So they are going after some of the organizers. So there's a lot of issues to take into care. At the same time, for me, it's also easy to whip yourself when you're working in a situation like this as a reporter, and you could become very dark-minded. But for me, it gives meaning to go somewhere and to feel that you could make some sort of contribution to tell a story. And like I said, this was, for me, it felt like I was just bringing a camera, and I knew I would be able to publish a story about what is, for me, one of the most important things happening in the world right now. And so that's, of course, it's not only bad, but it's so many dilemmas and so many risks. And just to follow up on what Gita said, there's a course called, there's an organization, an American organization called RISK, which was established by Sebastian Junger. He's writing books, and he made Restrepo and Korangal, two documentaries about the war in Afghanistan, really good movies. He made Restrepo together with Tim Hetherington, which was a great photographer.
Yes.
who was killed in Libya some years ago. So this organization, it supports freelancers working in conflict zones, and you could pay very little money to get a very good course and follow-up, where you both learn like basic security training and first aid. So that helped me, and it helped hundreds of others. And there are many similar or some similar organizations. So definitely, if people are thinking about going into a conflict zone, working as a journalist or documentary filmmaker, that I really recommend to take the security courses before, because it can be extremely dangerous and things happen very fast.
It's a helpful tip. Thank you. And Sky?
Yeah, so I this spurred so much for me. I think of sort of the question of how to operate in a conflict zone. I kind of break it down into three ideas. One is just the practical, right? I mean, the essential question is, how do you film in a conflict zone and not get killed, right? If any of you have seen that 2001 film War Photographer about James Nachtwey, a really famous war photographer, I think he says at some point in it, you know, there's no such thing as an old war photographer, right? So there's that foundation that you start with. How do you film this story and survive? But then the second thing is these ethical questions that Gita, you talked to so eloquently. I think we do have an obligation and a responsibility to operate with nuance and care with those we're collaborating with, based on their needs, right? Not based on our needs, but based on their needs on the ground, their safety, their security. And thirdly, the narrative component to this, which you also noted, Gita, which is, I do think there's a narrative question as well, right? Are you observing and documenting and telling this story in a way that that they're okay with, that they want the story told as well as subjects? And speaking for myself, one of my greatest moments of joy or victory on Hunger Ward was when I sent my cut of the film through encrypted services to show to Dr. Aida, right, in our film. And her response back to me was that she loved the film. She loved how we portrayed her in the project that she collaborated with us. And that was really important to me, right? That she appreciated the way we told the story. And I think it can take place in different ways. My last thought is that, you know, we covered a missile strike in the north of the country, where we interviewed Ali Schwan, who survived the strike. And after the missile strike, he took out his cell phone and started recording the aftermath of the strike. And that is the only non-original footage that we didn't film that we included in the film. And we did it because we wanted to honor his story and his experience. And I think, you know, how you integrate, you know, I don't think I would have done that unless, or thought of that maybe, unless he wanted me to, right? But it was his footage and his story, and he spoke so eloquently to his experience. It served as a distillation for all the other missile strike victims and survivors in the North. And I wanted to honor his experience. And, you know, to me, I watched that section of our film now, and I'm deeply moved by his experience, right? It's sort of the
Within your own film.
Yeah, it's the spirit,
Right.
It's the spirit of our film. It really is the core. And I think I'm proud of that, right? If there's any moment I'm proud of, it's him telling his story in that way.
Wow. Well, we're going to have to start wrapping it up there. I've gotten the 5-minute warning, and this has been a rich discussion with each of you. I just wanted to make sure that we let the audience know where they can see each of your films. So Maya, where can folks look to find Then Comes the Evening?
So the film doesn't have a distributor yet, unfortunately, but it's in AMPA's screening room if you are part of that group. Okay. Otherwise, it has a pretty big festival round, so I think it's still somewhere on some festivals.
It'll be, okay, keep your eyes peeled for festival play.
Still alive, yeah.
Got it. And then Anders, you mentioned it's on Field of Vision.
Yes, it hasn't been published yet, but it will soon be out on Field of Vision. It's fieldofvision.org.
Brilliant. And Gita, same with Topic Studios.
So we will eventually be screening also on Topic, and then there will at some point be with AMPAS as well.
And Sky?
Yeah, we're doing a series of virtual screenings in the next 6 weeks that are all listed on hungerward.org. So those are the virtual screenings and Q&As we're doing in the next month and a half. And then we're in talks with distributors. I don't want to talk about those details yet, but it will be available to the general public shortly, but I can't really speak to the details. And it's also on the AMPAS portal.
Brilliant, brilliant. All right, well, I want to say thank you to Gita and Anders, Sky and Maya for joining us for this conversation. It's been wonderful to speak with you each with a bit more depth about your brilliant films. And I want to tell our audience to come back and join us at Facebook Live at 4 p.m., where Tom Powers, our artistic director, will return. He's going to be discussing the theme of personal histories, a grouping of shorts around personal histories. And then join us again tomorrow, where we will shift to the features portion of the 2020 shortlist. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, filmmakers, and best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody.
So much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.